the grief had a schedule. It rose with Lena at 5, a cold weight in her chest as she started the coffee. It sat with her on the porch as she watched the pre-dawn light filter through the dense Oregon pines, and it followed her into the old blue pickup truck, a silent passenger for the 40-mile drive to the clinic. It was a routine, and routine was the only thing that kept the silence from swallowing her whole. 1 year, 3 months, and 6 days since the slick asphalt and the screech of twisting metal had taken everything. Her father, her mother, her brother. The cabin, their weekend project, had become her fortress and her tomb, a place so saturated with their memory it felt like breathing ghosts. The dark green scrubs she wore were armor. The work was a drug, a temporary anesthetic of vitals and charts and other people's pain. Buster, her father's stoic German Shepherd mix, was the only living thing that shared her isolation. He was a warm, heavy presence against the passenger door, his breathing a steady rhythm against the truck's rattling engine. Today, the sky was the color of a fresh bruise, low and heavy with the promise of the season's first real blizzard. The forecast had been unequivocal, 24 inches by midnight, more by morning. She'd done her final supply run, the truck bed loaded with salt, propane, and enough non-perishables to last a month. She just wanted to get back, to lock the door and let the storm rage outside her walls. They were 10 miles from the turnoff to her long, unpaved driveway when Buster sat bolt upright. A low growl rumbled in his chest, a sound of deep, instinctual wrongness. Lena slowed the truck, her own senses on high alert. The dog's instincts were an instrument she'd learned to trust implicitly. He didn't growl at deer or coyotes. This was different. And then she saw it. Tucked just off the road, partially obscured by a thicket of snow-dusted ferns, was a black van. It was on its side, the passenger window shattered, the metal body accordioned against a massive Douglas fir. It was a city vehicle, sleek and expensive, as out of place here as a tuxedo at a lumberjack competition. Her first thought was to drive on, call it in from the cabin. A wreck like that, in this weather, on this road, screamed trouble. But the nurse in her, the deeply ingrained imperative to act, wouldn't let her. She pulled the truck over, the tires crunching on the icy shoulder. "Stay," she commanded Buster, who was now whining, his eyes fixed on the scene. The wind was a physical thing, stealing the air from her lungs and biting at the exposed skin of her face and hands. She grabbed the heavy-duty flashlight and a medical jump kit from behind the seat, her heart pounding a tense, unwelcome rhythm. The air smelled of pine, cold earth, and the faint, metallic tang of gasoline. There was no movement from the van. She circled it cautiously, her light cutting through the growing gloom. The driver's side was empty. Then the beams swept past the wreck, catching on something dark against the graying snow 20 feet away. It was a man. He was sitting upright, propped against the base of another tree, one leg stretched out at an unnatural angle. In the periphery of her light, she saw the glint of metal and rubber. A wheelchair, tipped on its side a few feet from him. A man in a wheelchair, in the middle of a forest, next to a crashed van, with a blizzard about to erase the world. Every nerve in her body screamed trap, ambush, wrong. She took a step back, her hand tightening on the cold metal of the flashlight. She could get in her truck and be gone in 30 seconds. No one would ever know. But then the man's head moved, a slow, pained turn, and his eyes found the beam of her light. He didn't call out. He just watched her, a silent, stark figure against the vast, indifferent wilderness. The choice was never really a choice at all. Her grief had hollowed her out, but it hadn't scraped away her core. She took a breath, the frigid air burning her lungs, and walked toward him. He was Japanese, his face sharp and pale, etched with pain but held in a mask of immense control. Dark, wet hair was matted to his forehead with what looked like blood. He was dressed in a thin, tailored black coat, absurdly inadequate for the weather, now soaked through. His gaze was intense, analytical, even in his state. He wasn't assessing her as a rescuer. He was assessing her as a variable, a potential threat, or a tool. Lena felt it in her bones. Buster's growl echoed in her memory. "Are you hurt?" she asked, her voice clipped, professional. It was her nurse voice, a shield of detached confidence. His eyes flickered down to his left leg, then back to her face. A single, sharp nod. She knelt, keeping a careful distance, and ran the flashlight beam over him. There was a gash on his forehead, but it was the leg that was the problem. The fabric of his expensive wool trousers was shredded and dark with blood around the thigh. "I'm a nurse," she said, more to herself than to him. "I need to see the injury. The storm's coming in hard. We don't have time to wait for an ambulance. They won't make it up here." He said nothing, his jaw tight. His stillness was unnerving. It wasn't the stillness of shock. It was the stillness of discipline. She reached into her kit for trauma shears. "I'm going to have to cut your pants," he gave another curt nod. The shears made a rasping sound as they sliced through the fine material. The moment the fabric fell away, she saw it. Not a compound fracture, not a laceration from the crash. It was a bullet wound. Small, neat entry point on the anterior thigh, a larger, messier exit wound on the back. A through and through. Her breath hitched. This changed everything. This wasn't an accident. She looked up at his face. His eyes were closed now, but his expression was unchanged. He was either unconscious or conserving every last scrap of energy. The blizzard was no longer a promise. The first thick, heavy flakes began to fall, melting on his pale skin. Leaving him here was a death sentence. Taking him with her felt like pulling the pin on a grenade. She thought of the empty cabin, of the long nights, of the silence. What was one more ghost? "Okay," she whispered to the wind. Okay, getting him into the truck was a clumsy, brutal affair. He was heavier than he looked, a dead weight of muscle and bone. She half-dragged, half-carried him, his arms slung over her shoulder, his good legs scrabbling for purchase. He grunted with pain, a low, guttural sound, but never cried out. She maneuvered him into the passenger seat, shoving Buster into the narrow space behind it. The dog whined, his nose pressed against the man's shoulder, sniffing, before settling with a huff. Lena slammed the door, ran to the driver's side, and threw the truck into gear, spinning the wheels on the slickening road before they found traction. The van, the wheelchair, the whole bizarre scene disappeared into the swirling snow of her rear-view mirror. The cabin was small, one large room with a sleeping loft, built from cedar logs her father had milled himself. It smelled of wood smoke and dried herbs. She guided the man to the worn leather armchair by the stone fireplace, the one her dad had always sat in. He collapsed into it, his head falling back against the cushions. Buster immediately took up a position on the hearth rug, positioning himself between Lena and the stranger, a furry, growling guardian. "Don't," she said to the dog, her voice tired. "Just don't." The man's name, he'd finally offered in a low rasp, was Riku. He offered nothing else. Lena didn't ask. Knowledge felt like a liability. She stoked the fire until it roared, the heat pushing back the invasive cold. Then she went to work. She pulled a low stool over and laid out her supplies on the floor. Antiseptic wash, sutures, sterile gauze, forceps. The clinical ritual settled her nerves. "This is going to hurt," she stated, not asked. "I don't have any anesthetic." "Proceed," he said, his voice a dry whisper. His eyes were open again, tracking her every move. She cleaned the wound with firm, efficient motions. It was already showing the first signs of infection, the edges red and inflamed. He didn't flinch, didn't make a sound, but she saw the muscles in his jaw bunch, the cords in his neck stand out. As she worked on the exit wound on the back of his thigh, she had to shift his weight. The movement pulled his shirt up, and she saw it. Sprawling across the entire landscape of his back was a dragon, a masterpiece of ink and shadow, its claws gripping lightning, its eyes seeming to stare right at her. An Irizumi tattoo, intricate and vast. Her blood went cold. She'd seen pictures. She knew what it signified. Yakuza. She finished her work in silence, her hands moving with the steady precision of long practice. She stitched the torn flesh, her movements neat and economical, and wrapped the thigh in thick layers of gauze. She cleaned the gash on his head and checked his pupils. No sign of a concussion, but he was feverish, his skin hot to the touch. She got a blanket and draped it over him, then stood up, her back aching. The cabin, her sanctuary, now felt like a cage. She was trapped in a snowstorm with a wounded gangster. The wind howled outside, rattling the window panes, sealing them in. Days bled into one another, marked only by the shifting light through the snow-caked windows. The storm was relentless, a solid wall of white that had buried the world. Time inside the cabin slowed to a thick, syrupy crawl. Their interactions were minimal, stripped to the bare essentials of survival. In the morning, Lena would check his dressing, her touch professional and impersonal. She'd clean the wound, apply fresh gauze, her face a mask of neutrality. He would endure it with that same unnerving stillness, his eyes following her. His fever rose on the second day, and she spooned broth and water into him like a child, her expression grim. He submitted without protest, a concession to the weakness of his body, but his gaze never lost its sharp, assessing quality. She fell into her routines with a fierce, protective determination. She split wood for the fire, the rhythmic thud of the axe against the rounds a counterpoint to the howling wind. She shoveled a path to the generator shed, her muscles burning in the biting cold. She cooked simple meals, the smells of soup and baking bread filling the small space. And he watched. From the depths of the leather armchair, he watched. He watched her mend a tear in her jacket with a needle and thread. He watched her organize her medical supplies. He watched her talk to Buster in low, soothing tones. His silence was a palpable presence in the room, a weight that pressed on the air. It wasn't an empty silence. It was an observant one. He was learning her, mapping her rhythms, understanding the landscape of her life through her actions. Buster remained the unwavering border between them. The dog never left her side, his body a solid, furry wall. If Riku shifted in his chair, the dog's head would lift, a low growl vibrating in his chest. Riku, in turn, treated the dog with a kind of detached respect. He never tried to pet him, never spoke to him. He simply acknowledged his presence, another piece on the board. One afternoon, Lena was cleaning her father's old hunting rifle, the familiar weight and smell of gun oil a strange comfort. Riku's eyes locked onto the weapon, and for the first time, his expression shifted into something she couldn't read. It wasn't fear.
It was
Recognition. A professional appraisal. On the third day, the fever broke. He woke from a long sleep, his eyes clear for the first time. She had a mug of coffee waiting for him, black, the way she drank it. She handed it to him, their fingers brushing for a fraction of a second. A jolt, small but distinct, passed between them. He took the mug, his gaze holding hers a moment too long.
"Thank you," he said.
The words were simple, but they landed with the weight of a significant debt being acknowledged. Later that evening, the generator sputtered and died. The cabin was plunged into darkness, the only light coming from the flickering heart of the fire. Lena sighed, a sound of pure exhaustion. "Fuel lines probably frozen," she said to the shadows. "I'll have to fix it in the morning." She lit a few kerosene lamps, their warm glow pushing back the oppressive dark. The firelight threw their shadows, long and distorted, against the log walls. He was just a silhouette in the big chair. "You are not afraid of the dark," he stated. It wasn't a question. "I'm not afraid of much anymore," she replied, her voice flat. She sat on the hearth, as far from him as she could get, and stared into the flames. The silence stretched, filled only by the crackle of burning pine and the soft sigh of the wind finding its way through the eaves. It was in that shared darkness that a tiny, almost imperceptible shift occurred. The tension didn't vanish, but it changed its nature. It was no longer the sharp edge of fear, but the dull, heavy pressure of two isolated souls occupying the same fragile space. The fourth day dawned with a blinding white glare. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world transformed, sculpted into soft, silent drifts. The quiet was more profound than the noise had been. Lena spent the morning clearing the generator's fuel line, her breath pluming in the frigid air. When she came back inside, stamping the snow from her boots, Riku was attempting to stand. He was using the arm of the chair and a fireplace poker as a makeshift crutch, his face pale and beaded with sweat. "What are you doing?" she demanded, rushing forward. "I cannot remain in this chair," he said, his voice tight with effort. "A body that does not move is a body that is waiting to die." She wanted to argue, to tell him he'd tear his stitches, but the raw determination in his face stopped her. Instead, she moved to his side. "Fine," she said, her tone sharp. "But you're not using that poker. You'll put a hole in my floor." She disappeared into a storage closet and emerged with one of her father's old walking sticks, a sturdy piece of hickory. She handed it to him. He took it, his grip sure and strong. He used it to lever himself to his feet, hissing as the weight settled on his injured leg. He stood there for a long moment, swaying slightly, a man reacquainting himself with gravity. His first journey was a slow, painful shuffle from the chair to the window. He stood there for a long time, looking out at the endless expanse of snow, his hand braced against the cold glass. Lena watched him, a strange knot in her stomach. He was a predator, caged but not tamed. Later, while he was asleep in the chair, she decided to change the dressing on his makeshift bed on the floor, the pile of blankets and pillows she'd used before moving him. As she gathered the soiled linens, her fingers brushed against something hard and flat hidden beneath a pillow. It was a phone. Not a normal phone. It was thin, matte black, with no branding. It felt dense, military grade. A satellite phone. The discovery landed like a punch to the gut. It was confirmation of every fear she'd suppressed. This man was not just a gangster. He was important. He had resources. And he had hidden this from her. She quickly tucked it back under the pillow, her heart hammering. He was a threat, not just because of who he was, but because of who might be looking for him. Her cabin was no longer a sanctuary. It was a hiding place. And she was now part of it. The weight of that knowledge was suffocating. She felt the fragile peace of the last few days shatter, replaced by the cold, sharp reality of her situation. She was an accomplice. The lie of his helplessness evaporated the next evening. Lena was at the wood stove, a pot of soup simmering, her back to him. She reached for a jar of herbs on a high shelf, her fingers fumbling, and the glass jar slipped. It fell, tumbling end over end. She gasped, bracing for the sound of shattering glass. It never came. She turned. Riku was there, halfway between the chair and her, one hand outstretched. The jar was nestled perfectly in his palm. He hadn't just caught it. He had moved from a seated position, covering 10 feet of floor on a wounded leg, and intercepted it with the fluid grace of a striking snake. It was a movement that defied his injury, a flash of pure, disciplined lethality. Their eyes met over the jar. The mask was gone. In its place was the calm, absolute competence of a man for whom violence was a language. The air crackled with the unspoken truth. He was not a victim. He was a warrior. He held the jar for a beat longer, then placed it carefully on the counter. He didn't offer an explanation. He didn't need to. The action was the explanation. He turned and limped back to his chair, the brief, explosive display of prowess leaving a ringing silence in its wake. Lena's hand trembled as she picked up the ladle. The soup suddenly seemed unimportant. She was sharing her home with something far more dangerous than she had imagined. The knowledge didn't make her more afraid. Strangely, it made her feel calmer. The ambiguity was gone. She now knew exactly what she was dealing with. Later, the silence became too heavy to bear. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, painting the room in soft shades of orange and deep shadow. Lena was standing by the mantelpiece, her fingers tracing the frame of the single photograph that sat there. Her family, smiling on a sunny day, frozen in a moment of happiness that felt like it belonged to another lifetime. "My family," she said, her voice quiet but clear in the still room. She didn't turn to look at him. A drunk driver ran a red light. I was in the back seat. I was the only one who walked away. She hadn't spoken those words aloud to anyone. They hung in the air, raw and bleeding. Riku was silent for a long time. The only sound was the settling of the logs in the fireplace. She expected pity, or platitudes, or an uncomfortable quiet. What she got was something else entirely. "In my world," he began, his voice a low baritone that seemed to absorb the shadows. "Loyalty is supposed to be a shield that guards your back." He paused, and she could feel his gaze on her, intense and unblinking. "But the most dangerous wound is not from an enemy in front of you. It is from the man standing behind you, holding that shield. When he decides to turn it into a blade." It wasn't a confession, not in any legal sense, but it was a truth. A shard of his own broken world, offered in exchange for hers. He was telling her he was betrayed. He was telling her why he was here, wounded and alone, without telling her anything at all. She finally turned to look at him. His face, illuminated by the dying fire, was stark and unguarded. The dangerous outsider and the broken nurse, two survivors of different kinds of wreckage, meeting in the quiet devastation. A fragile bridge of understanding formed between them in that moment, built not on sympathy, but on the shared, grim architecture of loss. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was enough. The exchange was complete. The first sound was wrong. It wasn't the wind, or the groan of a snow-laden branch. It was a whine. High-pitched, mechanical, and getting closer. A snowmobile. Then another. Buster was on his feet instantly, a deep, furious bark tearing from his throat as he launched himself at the door. Lena froze, her blood turning to ice. Riku was already moving. The pained, careful man of the last few days was gone, replaced by a being of pure, cold focus. "The cellar," he commanded, his voice like chipped flint. He pointed toward a trapdoor in the floor, hidden under a bearskin rug.
"Go. Now."
"Do not make a sound. Do not come out until I tell you." There was no room for argument in his tone. It was the voice of absolute command. He grabbed the heavy iron fireplace poker, the one he'd first tried to use as a crutch. He tested its weight in his hand, his movements economical and deadly. Headlights sliced through the darkness, sweeping across the windows. Lena scrambled to the trapdoor, her hands fumbling with the iron ring. She pulled it open, the scent of damp earth rising to meet her. She gave one last look at Riku. He was positioned in the shadows beside the door, a dark statue of lethal intent. He met her gaze, and for a fleeting second, his expression softened. It was a look of grim apology. Then it was gone. "Go," he repeated, softer this time. She dropped into the darkness, pulling the heavy door down, plunging herself into a world of black silence, the thud of the door sealing her in. Above her, the world erupted. She heard the crunch of boots on the porch, the splintering crash of the cabin door being kicked in. Shouted words in Japanese, sharp and angry. Then a heavy thud, a choked cry. A gunshot, deafening even through the floorboards. Another. The sound of a struggle, of bodies hitting the floor, of furniture overturning. It was a whirlwind of brutal, efficient violence. She huddled in the dark, her hands pressed over her ears, her body shaking uncontrollably. Buster was barking furiously, a frantic, savage sound that ended in a sudden, sharp yelp of pain. Then silence, a profound, terrifying silence that was worse than the noise. It stretched for an eternity. 1 minute. 5. She counted her own frantic heartbeats. Finally, a single, soft knock on the trapdoor above her. "Lena," Riku's voice. It was strained, breathless. "It is done. You can come out." She pushed the door open with trembling arms and climbed out. The scene was a tableau from a nightmare. Her cabin, her sanctuary, was destroyed. The door was a wreck of splintered wood. Her father's chair was overturned. And on the floor, in pools of blood that stained the pine planks a deep, horrific crimson, were 2 men, both dressed in black tactical gear, both dead. Riku was slumped against the far wall, his face ashen. There was a dark, spreading stain on his left shoulder. The fireplace poker lay near one of the bodies, its tip bloody. Her eyes darted around, looking for Buster. She found him near the hearth, whimpering. He had a shallow gash on his side, but he was alive. He limped toward her, pressing his head against her leg. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. The shock was a cold, clear blanket, sharpening her focus. She saw Riku, bleeding against her wall, and the nurse took over. She grabbed her medical kit, the second time she'd needed it for him, and knelt by his side. "They will have heard the shots," he rasped, his eyes struggling to focus on her. "More will come." "Be quiet," she ordered, her voice shaking but firm. She cut away the fabric of a shirt. It was another bullet wound, this one messy. The bullet was still in there. "This is going to be hell," she told him, her eyes meeting his. He just nodded, his jaw set. As she worked, digging into his flesh with sterilized forceps to retrieve the slug, there was no barrier between them.
No suspicion, no deception.
There was only the grim intimacy of shared violence, of survival. He grunted, a deep, guttural sound of agony, but his eyes never left her face. When she finally pulled the bullet free, a misshapen piece of lead that she dropped into a metal bowl with a clatter, he sagged with relief. As she stitched this new wound, the rising sun cast a pale, watery light through the shattered door, illuminating the carnage and the two survivors in its midst. The cost of her rescue was written in blood on her floor. As dawn broke, a fragile truce with the world was established. The air was still and cold. Riku, bandaged and pale, used his satellite phone. The conversation was short, a string of clipped, authoritative Japanese. "They are coming," he told her, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "You need to be gone when they arrive. They cannot know you were here." "This is my home," she said numbly, looking at the blood, the wreckage. "Not anymore," he replied, his tone laced with a deep, cutting regret. "Because of me, this place is no longer safe. They have a record of this location now. They will watch it." He pushed himself to his feet, leaning heavily on the wall. He walked to the table and laid something on it. A platinum credit card and a thick stack of $100 bills, bound with a simple paper band. "For the damage. For your trouble. To start again, somewhere else." Lena looked from the money to his face. It was the face of a man used to solving problems with wealth, to paying for silence, to settling debts. A cold, hard anger rose in her, cutting through the shock. She walked over, picked up the card and the cash, and held it out to him. "No," she said, her voice low and fierce. "I didn't do this for money." He looked at her, truly looked at her, and for the first time, she saw the powerful, dangerous man falter. He seemed to understand that he had offered a profound insult, that he was trying to put a price on something that was priceless. "My world. It taints everything it touches," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Then take it with you when you go," she shot back. She shoved the money into his hand. "Just get out." The sound of an engine grew in the distance. A large, black SUV, clean and imposing, appeared at the end of the driveway, its tires crunching on the fresh snow. Two men in dark suits got out. They moved with the same contained discipline as Riku, their eyes scanning everything, their faces blank. They helped him to the vehicle, his arms over their shoulders. Before he got in, he turned and looked at her one last time. He stood there, a wounded king being spirited away from a battleground he'd created in her life. He gave a short, formal bow, a gesture of profound, archaic respect that was jarringly out of place amidst the carnage. Then he was gone. The SUV drove away, leaving her alone in the blood-stained, violated silence of her home, with only a wounded dog and the ghosts of new violence for company. 3 months passed. Spring arrived in the mountains with a fierce, determined beauty, melting the snow and coaxing green shoots from the cold earth. Lena had not left. She had scrubbed the floors until her hands were raw, replacing the blood-stained planks with new pine that smelled fresh and alive. She had rebuilt the door, stronger this time. She had given a statement to the sheriff, a story about a break-in, about men she'd never seen before, a story she knew he didn't fully believe but couldn't disprove. The incident was filed away as another piece of strange rural violence unsolved. But something inside her had been rebuilt, too. The grief was still there, a foundational part of her, but it was no longer a suffocating shroud. The passive wish to fade away had been burned out of her by the sharp, terrifying immediacy of survival. The routines were different now. She still rose early, but now she spent the first hour of daylight outside, in a small plot of land she'd tilled herself. She was planting a garden, rows of peas, lettuce, and sturdy herbs. Her movements were no longer automatic. They were deliberate, filled with purpose. She was cultivating life. Buster was always nearby, no longer a tense sentinel but a calm companion, his side now healed into a thin, silvery scar. He would lie in the patch of sun near the young sprouts, watching her with soft eyes. The photo of her family still sat on the mantel, but it was no longer an icon of pure loss. It was a memory, a part of the story that led her here. One bright Tuesday afternoon, the sound of a vehicle coming up the long driveway made her look up from her weeding. It wasn't the sheriff's cruiser or a delivery truck. It was a simple black sedan, unassuming and clean. It parked where the black SUV had been. The driver's door opened, and Riku got out. He wasn't in a suit or a blood-soaked coat. He wore simple dark jeans and a plain gray shirt. He moved without a limp, without a walking stick. The only hint of the violence was the way he held his left shoulder slightly stiffly. He looked different in the sunlight, less like a creature of shadow and more like just a man. A man carrying an invisible weight. He stopped at the edge of her garden, not daring to step onto the tilled soil. He didn't approach the house. He just stood there, his hands empty at his sides, his gaze taking in the new door, the tended earth, and finally, her. His face was unreadable, but his posture was one of profound humility. He was a visitor asking for permission to be there, not a commander or a fugitive. Buster, who had tensed at the car's arrival, looked from Riku to Lena, then let out a soft, low woof of air and laid his head back down on his paws. It was a release. A verdict. Lena slowly stood up, wiping the rich, dark soil from her hands onto her jeans. She looked at him, the man who had brought chaos to her door and, in doing so, had inadvertently shown her how to live again. The silence stretched, but this time it was peaceful, a space waiting to be filled. "I just put the coffee on," she said, her voice even and clear. "You want a cup?" It was a simple question. It was forgiveness. It was an invitation to begin again. He met her eyes and a slow, small smile touched his lips for the first time. He gave a single grateful nod.